The boundary between prehistory and recorded history is marked by the invention of written languages. Prehistoric cultures are difficult to understand because the only evidence we have for them comes from the archaeological record, whereas later on we also have the benefit of inscriptions and texts. Written languages first appeared during the Bronze Age in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Minoan Crete, amongst other places. But for some locations, the Bronze Age was still a pre-literate period, with written texts appearing a lot later. There are many mysteries about our prehistoric ancestors, such as what they believed, the type of rituals they carried out, and how their societies were structured. In modern times, there is a tendency to regard Neolithic and even earlier cultures as having been matriarchal, a key aspect of this being goddess worship. This is often assumed because of statues and figurines thought to depict female deities, such as the Venus of Willendorf from Paleolithic Austria or the corpulent ladies from Neolithic Malta, although, as mentioned in previous videos, the latter are mostly of indeterminate sex. But all in all, we don't know for sure if prehistoric societies were patriarchal, matriarchal, or neither. We also have no way of knowing the extent of equality between the sexes in those times, or indeed the extent of equality between different people within a community. When ornate tombs are found with rich grave goods, this evidence points to such burials as having been for leaders, meaning that that particular culture had an elite segment in its society. In Neolithic Malta, such distinctions don't appear in tombs, and yet for such enormous megalithic structures to have been built, there is an idea that some sort of social organization must have existed. It's also not likely that all ancient societies were the same. There may have been stark differences between them in terms of their social structures that we simply can't determine from the archaeological record. A good example of a tomb which points to both a hierarchical society and equality between the sexes is the Iron Age site of Lefkandi on the island of Euboea in the Aegean. The previous Bronze Age in the Aegean was characterized by the palace cultures, sophisticated civilizations that were administered by large-scale palace complexes. The first of these cultures was the Minoans based on Crete, but with a broader sphere of influence across the region. Their culture was then largely replaced by the Mycenaeans, who spoke an Indo-European language, the forerunner to modern Greek. Around 1350 BCE, the palace culture collapsed, initiating what's being called the Dark Age, although scholars prefer not to use that term these days. This Dark Age tomb at Lefkandi tells us some interesting things about Iron Age society. On the top of a hill at a site called Toumba, 2 shafts were dug for the burials of a man and a woman. The man was cremated and his ashes placed in a bronze jar that was already ancient at that time. Iron grave goods were placed alongside the jar, including a sword and a spearhead. In the second shaft, a woman was buried with ornate ancient gold jewellery and an iron knife. A large mud brick building was then erected over the top of the shafts. These graves point towards an elite warrior class, so they show that a hierarchy did exist at that time, which cast doubt over general societal equality. But it does show that women belonging to such families were treated with prestige. So that's an example of how tombs can teach us about ancient societal structures, and that's useful in the culture I'm discussing today. But the one I'm talking about is from a time in recorded history when we have a lot more to go on. I'm looking into the equality between the sexes that was supposedly a cornerstone of Etruscan culture and shocked the ancient Greeks and Romans. Even though there's quite a lot of information on the Etruscans because of the significant amount of material culture they left behind, as well as the texts written about them by the Greeks and Romans, an air of mystery still surrounds these people. I wonder how much of their societal structure and apparent equality could have been rooted in the more ancient past, the time we have little evidence for. Were the remnants of some ancient matriarchal culture lurking amongst the Etruscans, who were quite different from the many of the contemporary cultures in the Mediterranean? Before I go on, in case you don't know and haven't watched my previous videos, the Etruscans were a cultural group that inhabited an area of the Italian peninsula north of Rome, including parts of the modern areas of Lazio, Tuscany, and Umbria. They appeared around the Iron Age and were present through much of classical antiquity before being absorbed into the Roman Empire. They spoke a language isolate, but eventually started to write this language using the Greek alphabet. Their later art was heavily influenced by trade with the Greeks as well as Egyptian contacts during what's known as the Orientalizing period. When I think of ancient Greece, I picture families walking around grand temples and listening to philosophers. I imagine men and women in stunning robes, headdresses, and jewellery weaving in and out of life-size marble statues. I think of couples holding raucous wine-fueled dinner parties in villas filled with mosaics and frescoes. But the problem with this picture is the women, because in actual fact they were largely confined to their homes, and even then to a specific area within their homes called the gymnasium. They were not allowed to roam about the streets and attend events except on specific occasions, and the famous Greek dinner party known as the symposium was held by men for men in the male quarters within the house called the andron. The only women allowed to attend were high-class prostitutes known as heterae. They were also the ones mainly getting an education so that they could talk to the men in the symposia. Archaic Rome wasn't much better. A lot of evidence points to women having been completely forbidden from drinking alcohol. Something called the ius osculi was practiced where the husband or male relative of a woman would kiss her to see if she had been drinking. The Greek deity Dionysus, the equivalent of the Roman Bacchus, might have been the god of wine, but that wine was not for everyone. So you can imagine the shock when the ancient Greeks and Romans realized Etruscan women were allowed to attend and participate in athletic events, drink with men, and wander around the streets. Texts from classical antiquity show just how shocked they were. But as we know, such information could have been biased, especially when it was written later. However, similar evidence comes from other sources as well. Frescoes and paintings on pottery show that the Etruscan women had a level of independence unmatched by their ancient Greek and Roman contemporaries. The ancient Greek historian Theopompus wrote, "Sharing wives is an established Etruscan custom. Etruscan women take particular care of their bodies and exercise often, sometimes along with the men and sometimes by themselves. It is not a disgrace for them to be seen naked. They do not share their banquet couches with their husbands, but with the other men who happen to be present, and they propose toasts to anyone they choose. They are expert drinkers." Excellent. "And very attractive. The Etruscans raise all the children that are born without knowing who their fathers are." There are also many frescoes showing women dancing, playing musical instruments, and reclining alongside men. This, as well as the fact women appear frequently on murals, pottery, and ancestor dedications in tombs, shows that women were accorded as much respect as men. In ancient Greece, women rarely inherited property. If the male direct line died out, then it would pass to other indirect male relatives. Etruscan women, however, were allowed to inherit property if the direct male line didn't survive. Not exactly equality, but relatively speaking, compared to ancient Greece, not too bad. Funerary inscriptions show that Etruscan women were identified using both their matronymic and patronymic names, and also had their individual names inscribed in pottery vessels and other personal belongings. They were often buried with grave goods that were just as rich as their male counterparts. Much evidence for this comes from the necropolis di Banditaccia at Civitate, north of Rome, which I visited a couple of months ago. The sarcophagus of the spouses shows a married couple reclining together. Although this might show a particular ritual, it's also possible that it shows a man and woman, husband and wife, banqueting alongside one another, something that was not allowed in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. This is now housed in the National Etruscan Museum of Rome. Contrary to some of the more snarky texts about Etruscan women being loose, it's known that the family unit was much prized and that traditional female pursuits, such as weaving, were still practiced by them. In fact, their names and dedications were often incised onto spules. However, their identity as individuals and their opportunities to participate in private banquets and public events set them apart from ancient Greek and Roman women. The role of Etruscan women in society got quite a bit of coverage by Greek and Roman writers, and it wasn't normally shown in a positive light. But there was one skill of the Etruscans that they heaped praise on, and that was the power of divination. The Roman Senate often consulted Etruscan priests to interpret omens. These were considered hereditary skills, and the Roman Senate passed laws to protect them. However, it's not clear if women played a role in divination or not. Most of the evidence, such as figurines and murals, shows male priests carrying out divinatory rites. There is some limited evidence, though, that shows women may have been involved. 12 funerary inscriptions from Vulci refer to the women buried there as having been hatrenku, which is thought to mean priestesses with divinatory powers in Etruscan. The story of the Etruscan wife of the fifth king of Rome portrays a woman whose divinatory skills played an important part in the career of her husband. Tanaquil was married to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, with both of them being from Tarquini, part of Etruria. According to the story, which is probably in part legend, Tanaquil thought her husband should be a leader, but because his father was a foreigner from Corinth, he wasn't allowed to enter Etruscan politics. So his wife persuaded him that they should move to Rome and try their luck there, a plan that eventually worked. The story is full of prophetic anecdotes. When they arrived in Rome, an eagle stole Tarquinius's cap, only to return it, something that his wife interpreted as meaning he would one day be king. It was also said that she attached healing charms to a belt, which was then imbued with miraculous properties. Later writers referred to her as a woman well skilled in celestial prophecies. Tanaquil also raised the future husband of her daughter, Servius Tullius, who, upon Tarquinius's assassination, became the sixth king of Rome. Later writers couldn't quite explain his genealogy and thought he may have been a slave. Legend has it that as a child his hair caught fire while he slept but caused no injury and disappeared when he woke up. Tanaquil interpreted this as an omen that the child would one day be king and supported his rise to greatness. At Cerveteri, one female burial in the tomb now referred to as Regalini Galassi was very lavish indeed. The woman, called Lathia, was buried with hundreds of stunning grave goods, including gold bracelets and a throne. The bracelets depict women conducting some sort of ceremony, which has led to the suggestion they were priestesses. It's possible Lathia was a queen or a priestess or some combination of the two, and that the bracelets showed her rites and rituals. She was buried in a family tomb with men, but their burials were not as lavish as hers. In the tomb of the Baronet Tarquinia, a fresco shows a female figure appearing to consecrate something brought by a man and a boy piper. Scholars think this female figure may represent a priestess conducting some sort of a ritual. Priestesses and goddesses are obviously known from ancient Greek and Roman culture, and in spite of their prominence, society was still very patriarchal. So even if the Etruscans did have women in positions of religious power, it doesn't necessarily mean that women were treated vastly different from men. However, priestesses in ancient Greece and Rome were known to live incredibly restricted lives. Think about the Oracle of Delphi. Little is known about how the priestess Pythia was chosen, but it's thought that she had to have led a life of good character. Then there's the fact that the fate of Rome was thought to depend on the chastity of the Vestal virgins and their ability to keep the fire burning. If the fire went out, they were punished severely. So it's tempting to see Etruscan priestesses as wielding authority and living under less prohibitions than their Greek and Roman counterparts, just as it seems the everyday women did. Could the Etruscans have held the memories of a more equal culture in the ancient past? I think so. When I visited the necropolis of Banditacha and realised they also used Cyclopean masonry, an interesting construction technique with a sketchy history, I did think those Etruscans knew more than we even realise. Here's a quick video of that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also on Patreon and really appreciate the support. Also, come and find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where I post regularly. And take a look at my website for more information on the places I visit.